I am Carrie Sullivan, 35 years old, and the strategic brains behind Harrison Technologies' most successful initiatives. After 5 years of climbing the corporate ladder through intelligence and hard work, I never expected my career would hinge on a single signature. When Robert Harrison's son Daniel returned from business school with an inflated ego and a VP title he hadn't earned, I knew trouble was brewing. What I didn't know was how his attempt to humiliate me would trigger the biggest corporate takeover our industry had seen in decades. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and hit that like and subscribe button before I take you through the corporate chess match that changed everything. My journey to Harrison Technologies wasn't what most would consider traditional. After graduating from Columbia Law School with honors, I spent 7 years at Wellington & Pierce, one of New York's most prestigious corporate law firms. I specialized in mergers and acquisitions, developing a reputation for finding hidden opportunities and potential pitfalls in even the most complex deals. The hours were brutal, but the experience was invaluable. I learned how corporations really worked from the inside out, and more importantly, I learned how to read between the lines of corporate governance documents. My connection to Harrison Technologies came through a chance meeting with Robert Harrison himself. I was representing the opposing side in an acquisition Harrison was pursuing. During negotiations, I identified a serious regulatory issue that would have derailed the entire deal had it gone unnoticed. Instead of being frustrated that I had complicated his plans, Robert was impressed. Most lawyers would have let us walk right into that mess and then charged extra to clean it up, he told me after the meetings concluded. You just saved both companies millions and months of headaches. 3 months later, Robert called with an unexpected offer to join Harrison Technologies as their chief strategy officer. The company had grown from a small startup in Robert's garage to a billion-dollar technology firm specializing in enterprise security solutions. They were at a critical growth stage, and Robert wanted someone with my legal and strategic background to help navigate the increasingly complex landscape. The compensation package was generous, but what really attracted me was the chance to help build something. At the law firm, I only saw companies during transactions or crises. This was an opportunity to be part of the ongoing story. Harrison Technologies had a reputation for innovation and a strong corporate culture. Robert had built the company on merit rather than connections. People advanced based on results, not relationships. The offices were modern and open, encouraging collaboration across departments. When I joined, there were just over 500 employees, but that number would double within my first 3 years. My relationship with Robert quickly evolved into a mentor-mentee dynamic. He had an incredible business instinct, and I had the analytical skills and legal knowledge to execute and refine his vision. We worked well together, and the company thrived under our complementary leadership styles. Robert often invited me to board meetings to present on strategic initiatives, something unusual for someone relatively new to the executive team. It was during my 2nd year that I first heard about Daniel Harrison, Robert's only son. He had been attending business school at Harvard, and Robert occasionally mentioned him with obvious pride. From these conversations, I gathered that Daniel had been given every advantage in life but hadn't yet proven himself in the business world. Daniel will be joining us after he graduates, Robert announced during an executive meeting about future leadership planning. He'll need to learn the business from the ground up. Several of us exchanged glances. Robert had always promoted based on merit, and this felt like a departure from that principle. Still, I reserved judgment. Perhaps Daniel would surprise us all with his talents and work ethic. In those early years, I built strong relationships across the company. Jessica Martinez became both my executive assistant and closest confidant at Harrison. With 15 years at the company, she knew its history and people better than almost anyone. Marcus Chen, our chief financial officer, became another important ally. Like me, he valued data and logic over politics, and we often found ourselves on the same side of strategic debates. Marcus had been with Robert almost from the beginning, and was one of the few people who could speak candidly with him about any topic. Among the board members, Abigail Winters stood out as someone who recognized talent regardless of tenure or title. A successful entrepreneur who had sold her own tech company for hundreds of millions, she often supported my initiatives when other board members were more cautious. And then there was Victor Reynolds, representing Centaur Capital, the private equity firm that had invested $150 million during a funding round before I joined. Victor attended quarterly board meetings but otherwise remained in the background. His firm owned approximately 15% of Harrison Technologies, making them the largest shareholder after Robert himself. During my first 3 years, I led initiatives that increased revenue by 30%, expanded our market share in the financial sector, and successfully launched an international division that opened offices in London, Singapore, Sydney. My team was responsible for identifying and executing 2 strategic acquisitions that brought valuable intellectual property and talent into the company. The company was thriving with stock price reaching an all-time high. Robert frequently acknowledged my contributions in company-wide meetings and to the board. I felt secure in my position and excited about our trajectory. Little did I know that everything was about to change when Daniel Harrison finally joined the company. Daniel Harrison arrived at Harrison Technologies with the kind of fanfare usually reserved for a returning hero. An all-hands meeting was called, and Robert proudly introduced his son to the entire company. Daniel, 27 years old, with perfectly coiffed hair and a suit that probably cost more than some employees' monthly salaries, stood smiling confidently beside his father. I'm excited to announce that Daniel will be joining our executive team as Vice President of Innovation and Strategic Growth, Robert announced, beaming with pride. A murmur rippled through the audience. This was a newly created position that seemingly overlapped with several existing roles, including mine. More concerning was that Daniel was being parachuted directly into a VP-level role, skipping all the usual steps and vetting process that everyone else had to navigate. After the meeting, Jessica didn't mince words. 6 months out of business school and he's already a VP. People work years to reach that level here. Let's reserve judgment, I said, though I shared her concerns. Maybe he'll surprise us. My first one-on-one meeting with Daniel was scheduled for the following day. I prepared a thorough overview of our current strategic initiatives, market position, and challenges we were facing, hoping to establish a productive working relationship despite the unusual circumstances. Daniel was 20 minutes late to our meeting. He strolled in without apology, immediately taking the seat at the head of the conference table, typically reserved for the most senior person. So he said, leaning back in his chair, "Dad says you're good with paperwork and processes. That'll be useful as I implement some changes around here." The dismissive tone was impossible to miss, but I maintained my professionalism. "I'd love to hear your thoughts on potential changes, Daniel. But first I thought it might be helpful to review our current strategic position and initiatives." He glanced at his watch. "Just send me the bullet points in an email. I've got a lunch with the sales directors in 20 minutes. What I really wanted to talk about was my revitalization plan." Over the next 30 minutes, Daniel outlined what he called his vision for the future. It included a complete rebranding, a shift in product focus, and a reorganization of several departments. The ideas weren't just disruptive, they revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of our business model, customer needs, and the technical realities of our products. "These are certainly ambitious ideas," I said carefully when he finished. "Some of them might create significant challenges given our current contracts and technology architecture. Perhaps we could analyze the potential impacts together and develop an implementation approach that minimizes disruption." Daniel's expression hardened. "Dad brought me in to shake things up, not to maintain the status quo. We're moving too slow, and that's going to change." Over the next few weeks, Daniel began implementing what he called quick wins. He authorized an expensive office redesign, launched a marketing campaign that confused our existing customers, and hired several of his business school friends as strategic consultants at exorbitant rates. I tried to guide him professionally, providing data and reasoned arguments about why certain approaches might be problematic. But Daniel interpreted every suggestion as resistance. He began excluding me from meetings where my input would have been relevant, and started going directly to my team members with assignments without informing me. The first direct conflict came when Daniel presented my team's work as his own during a board meeting. We had spent months developing a strategic partnership with a complementary technology firm, and the deal was nearly finalized. Daniel had attended exactly one meeting about the partnership, yet he presented the entire initiative as his brainchild to the board. "Thanks to my Harvard connections, I was able to open doors and fast-track this partnership," he said, not even acknowledging my presence in the room. I caught Marcus's eye across the table. He subtly shook his head, suggesting I shouldn't make an issue of it in the meeting. After all, the partnership was good for the company regardless of who got credit. After the meeting, I approached Robert privately. "I'm concerned about communication channels regarding the Apex partnership," I said carefully. "My team has been working on this for months, but Daniel seemed to present it as a new initiative." Robert clapped me on the shoulder. "Carrie, you're one of our most valuable executives. Everyone knows your contributions. But Daniel is bringing fresh energy and perspectives. Let's give him some wins to build his confidence." It became clear that Robert had a blind spot when it came to his son. He interpreted Daniel's brashness as boldness, his dismissiveness as directness, and his poor decisions as learning opportunities. As Daniel's behavior continued, I began documenting everything. Every email, every meeting, every decision, both good and bad. It wasn't that I was building a case, I was protecting myself and the company. If Daniel's revitalization started causing serious damage, there would need to be a record of what happened and why. It was during this period that I first heard about the special investment agreement with Centaur Capital. Jessica, who had been with the company during that funding round, mentioned it casually over lunch. "The only reason Victor doesn't say anything about Daniel's antics is that change of control clause," she said. "It's like their insurance policy." "Change of control clause?" I asked. "When Centaur invested, they insisted on special provisions if leadership changed hands in certain ways. I don't know the details, just that Robert was reluctant but eventually agreed because we really needed the capital back then." This piqued my interest, but I filed it away as something to explore later. At that point, I was more concerned with Daniel's growing influence and the alliances he was forming. Daniel surrounded himself with executives who flattered him and reinforced his ideas no matter how impractical. Several department heads who had initially resisted his changes found themselves sidelined or loaded with busy work that kept them from their actual responsibilities. As Daniel consolidated his position, I increasingly found myself isolated. Meetings were scheduled when I had conflicts. My recommendations were ignored or dismissed without discussion. Resources were pulled from my department to fund Daniel's pet projects. 6 months after Daniel joined the company, he sent out a company-wide email announcing a major reorganization. To streamline operations and maximize synergies, the email read, "We will be implementing a new organizational structure effective immediately." I received the email at the same time as everyone else. My name was conspicuously absent from the list of department heads who would be leading the streamlined organization. The reorganization hit like a tsunami throughout Harrison Technologies. Overnight, entire teams were reshuffled, reporting lines changed, and projects reassigned. The carefully built structure that had supported our growth was dismantled in favor of Daniel's modern management approach. My team, which had previously reported directly to me, was now under Daniel's direct control. He wasted no time in asserting his authority, scheduling individual meetings with each of my key staff members without inviting me. "Just getting to know the troops," he said with a smirk when I questioned him about it. "No need to be territorial, Carrie." Within 2 weeks, 3 of my most talented team members were reassigned to what Daniel called special projects, which turned out to be glorified administrative tasks that wasted their expertise. Jackson, my brilliant market analyst, was now compiling weekly report summaries that an intern could handle. Stephanie, who had architected our successful Asian expansion strategy, was assigned to research potential office locations for hypothetical future use. I tried to address this with Daniel directly. "These reassignments aren't utilizing people's strengths," I said during one of our increasingly tense interactions. "We're wasting valuable talent." "I decide how talent is best utilized now," he replied dismissively. "Maybe that's why Dad brought me in. Fresh eyes see things differently." The situation worsened when I discovered Daniel's plan to launch a completely revamped product line that would replace our core offering within 6 months. The proposed changes weren't just ambitious, they were dangerous. The new system architecture had serious security vulnerabilities, would breach several major client contracts, and would require completely rebuilding integrations that our customers relied upon. I prepared a detailed analysis of the risks and presented it to Daniel, hoping facts and data might get through where professional courtesy had failed. "This is exactly the kind of risk-averse thinking that stifles innovation," he said after barely glancing at my report. "This is why traditional executives get disrupted by startups. You're too afraid to make big moves." "This isn't about fear," I countered. "It's about understanding our contractual obligations and the technical realities." These changes would expose our clients to significant security risks and could trigger penalty clauses in our enterprise agreements. You lawyers always see problems instead of opportunities, he scoffed. This is happening. Get on board or get out of the way. I took my concerns directly to Robert, requesting an urgent meeting. For the first time since I had joined the company, I had to wait 3 days to get on his calendar. Daniel showed me your concerns, Robert said as soon as I entered his office. I think you're being overly cautious, Carrie. Yes, there are risks, but playing it safe doesn't lead to breakthrough growth. Robert, this isn't about caution. The proposed architecture has fundamental security flaws that could expose our clients' data. We'd be in breach of at least 20 major contracts on day one. Robert frowned. Daniel assured me that his team has addressed all the technical concerns. What team? He hasn't consulted with any of our senior engineers. Mark and Sanjay from engineering haven't even seen the proposal. Daniel has brought in outside consultants with fresh perspectives. Robert set his tone, making it clear he wasn't interested in further debate. I've given him authority to lead this initiative. I expect everyone to support it, especially you, Carrie. I left Robert's office with a sinking feeling. For the first time, I was genuinely concerned about the company's future. Daniel wasn't just making bad decisions, he was actively protected from their consequences by his father. My isolation grew as Daniel's influence expanded. In meetings, he would talk over me or dismissively say, "We've already decided to go another direction," whenever I raised concerns. He began holding key strategy sessions without inviting me, then announcing decisions that affected my areas of responsibility. Despite the challenging environment, I began quietly building alliances with others who saw through Daniel's facade. Marcus, the CFO, was increasingly concerned about the financial implications of Daniel's decisions. Several senior engineers were alarmed by the technical directions being forced upon them. Even some board members, particularly Abigail Winters, had begun asking pointed questions about the rapid changes. During this difficult period, I spent evenings researching the company's bylaws and investment agreements. Jessica had mentioned the change of control clause with Centaur Capital, and I wanted to understand exactly what it entailed. Most of these documents were accessible to me due to my position, though some required discreet inquiries to our legal department. What I discovered was fascinating. When Centaur Capital had invested $150 million, they had indeed insisted on specific protections. If certain qualified executives were removed from their positions without board approval, it would trigger a change of control provision. This would grant Centaur special rights, including the ability to exercise warrants for additional shares at a predetermined price and seats on a restructured board. I also consulted with Angela, a former colleague from my law firm days who specialized in corporate governance. Being careful not to disclose specific company information, I asked hypothetical questions about executive protection clauses and investor rights. These provisions are like tripwires, Angela explained. They're designed to prevent major leadership changes without investor approval. If triggered, they can shift the power balance overnight. As I pieced together the implications, I kept detailed notes in a secure personal file. This wasn't about plotting revenge, it was about understanding all options should the situation continue to deteriorate. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began taking credit for successful initiatives, while publicly blaming others for failures, typically his own poor decisions. During one particularly painful executive meeting, he presented data showing declining performance in my former areas of responsibility. As you can see, these departments were clearly mismanaged before the reorganization, he said, pointedly looking at me. We're now implementing proper metrics and accountability. What he conveniently omitted was that the decline had only begun after his reorganization disrupted established workflows and reassigned key personnel. I stayed late most evenings, documenting events and ensuring that critical projects didn't completely derail despite the chaos. One night, while working in my office, I overheard Daniel speaking with one of his allies in the hallway, not realizing I was still there. "The old guard needs to go," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the partially open door. "Especially Carrie. She's the biggest obstacle to my vision. Dad still listens to her too much." "Are you sure that's the right move?" the other voice asked. "She has a lot of support among the senior teams." "Trust me," Daniel replied confidently. "I've got a plan to sideline her permanently. By next month, she'll be a non-issue." I remained perfectly still until they walked away, my heart racing despite my outward calm. This wasn't just office politics anymore. This was my career and the company's future at stake. I needed to be prepared for whatever Daniel was planning. The next day, I received a calendar invitation from Daniel's assistant. The subject line read, simply, Performance Review, Carrie Sullivan. It was scheduled for the following Monday, at 9 in the morning. After 5 years of exceptional performance, countless successful initiatives and consistent praise from Robert himself, I was suddenly facing a performance review from the inexperienced son who had been with the company less than a year. The trap was being set. Now I needed to decide how to respond. The weekend before my performance review with Daniel was spent in intense preparation. I reviewed every project, every email exchange, and every decision I'd been involved with over the past year. I also took a deep dive into Harrison Technologies' corporate governance documents, paying particular attention to the investment agreement with Centaur Capital. What I found confirmed my earlier discoveries and revealed additional details. The change of control provisions were specifically designed to prevent arbitrary removal of key executives who were listed in an appendix to the agreement. To my surprise, I was one of those named executives along with Robert Marcus and 2 other long-term leaders. The provision stated that if any 2 of these executives were removed from their positions or substantially demoted without formal board approval, it would trigger Centaur's rights. These included immediate vesting of share warrants at a favorable price representation on a reconstituted board of directors and control over certain major business decisions. The potential financial impact was enormous. If triggered, Centaur would effectively gain control of nearly 40% of the company at a fraction of its current market value, representing a transfer of approximately $199 million in equity value based on our latest valuation. Armed with this knowledge, I arrived at the office early on Monday morning, mentally prepared for whatever Daniel might have planned. I wore my most professional outfit, a tailored navy suit that always gave me confidence, and arranged my documents carefully in a leather portfolio. Daniel kept me waiting for 20 minutes past the scheduled time, an obvious power play that I had anticipated. When his assistant finally ushered me in, he was leaning back in his chair, feet propped on the desk that had once belonged to his father. "Carrie," he said with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks for coming in. Please have a seat." I sat down, maintaining a neutral expression. "Good morning, Daniel. I understand you wanted to discuss my performance." "Yes," he replied, lowering his feet and leaning forward with exaggerated seriousness. "I've been reviewing the departments under your supervision, and I have serious concerns about the direction and results." What followed was a 20-minute monologue of distorted facts, misrepresented data, and outright fabrications about my performance and the projects I had led. Daniel had carefully constructed a narrative that painted me as resistant to change, territorially protective of outdated methods, and unable to adapt to the new direction of the company. I listened without interruption, taking occasional notes and maintaining a calm exterior despite the absurdity of his claims. When he finally paused clearly, expecting an emotional response or desperate defense, I simply asked, "Have you shared these concerns with the board or your father?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "This is an internal management matter. The board doesn't need to be involved in day-to-day personnel decisions." "I see," I replied evenly. "And what outcome are you proposing based on these concerns?" Daniel leaned back, regaining his confidence. "Effective immediately, you're being demoted from your executive position. You'll be reassigned to a special projects role reporting directly to me." "And where will I be working?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. A smile spread across Daniel's face, the kind that showed he was savoring what he believed to be his moment of triumph. "We need your current office for the expansion of my innovation team. You'll be relocated to the office space in the basement level. It's a bit smaller, but it should be adequate for your new responsibilities." The basement offices were notoriously undesirable. Small, windowless rooms originally used for storage that had been hastily converted when the company expanded. Sending me there wasn't just a demotion, it was meant as a public humiliation. I nodded slowly, appearing to absorb the blow. "I understand, and who will be taking over my current responsibilities?" "I'll be assuming direct oversight of those areas," Daniel said, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. with support from the consultants I've brought in. I see, I said again. And is there paperwork for this reassignment? I assume this constitutes a material change to my employment terms. Of course, Daniel replied, sliding a document across the desk. Human Resources has prepared everything, just your signature needed at the bottom. I glanced at the document, which outlined exactly what Daniel had described as substantial demotion in both title and responsibilities. What caught my attention, however, was the signature line, not just for me, but also for the authorizing executive. Will you be signing as the authorizing executive? I asked casually. Daniel's chest puffed slightly with importance. Yes, as Vice President of Innovation and Strategic Growth, I have full authority to implement organizational changes. This was the moment of truth. Before we proceed, I just want to be clear who has signing authority for organizational changes of this magnitude. Typically, only the CEO or someone with specific delegated authority can approve executive reassignments. Daniel's expression darkened. Dad has given me full authority to restructure as needed. I'm signing as his designated representative. I nodded thoughtfully. In that case, would you mind signing first? Just so everything is properly authorized before I add my acknowledgement. Perhaps if Daniel hadn't been so eager to complete my humiliation, he might have been more cautious. But his desire to finalize his victory overrode any prudence. He scrawled his signature with a flourish, then slid the document back toward me. Your turn, he said with that same smug smile. Unless you'd prefer to resign instead. I looked at the signed document, then reached for my phone. Before I sign, there's a quick call I need to make. This isn't a negotiation, Carrie, Daniel said sharply. I'm not negotiating, I replied calmly. I just need to confirm a detail with one of our investors. Before Daniel could object, I dialed Victor Reynolds at Centaur Capital and put the call on speakerphone. Victor Reynolds speaking, came the crisp response after 2 rings. Victor, this is Carrie Sullivan from Harrison Technologies. I apologize for the unscheduled call, but I have an important governance matter to discuss. I'm here with Daniel Harrison, who has just signed a document demoting me from my executive position without board approval. I believe this action may trigger the change of control provisions in Section 7.3 of our investment agreement. There was a brief silence on the line, then Victor's voice, now alert with interest. Can you confirm that Daniel Harrison has signed as the authorizing executive on an official company document removing you from your position? Yes, I have the signed document in front of me, I confirmed. In that case, you are correct. This constitutes a triggering event under our agreement, as you are one of the protected executives listed in the appendix. Please email me a copy of the document immediately. Daniel's face had transformed from smug satisfaction to confusion to dawning horror as the conversation unfolded. What is this? He demanded, reaching for the document. I held up a hand to stop him. Victor, can you explain for Daniel's benefit what happens next under the terms of our agreement? Victor's voice was clinical, almost pleased. The change of control provision has been triggered. Centaur Capital's warrants for additional shares vest immediately at the predetermined price of $12 per share compared to the current market value of $47. This represents an immediate discount of approximately $199 million from market value. Our legal team will be contacting Harrison Technologies within the hour to begin implementing the governance changes outlined in Section 8 of the agreement, including the reconstitution of the board of directors. Daniel's face had drained of color. This can't be legal. You tricked me. No trick, Daniel, I said calmly. Just the consequences of making decisions without understanding the legal framework of the company. Perhaps you should have reviewed the investment agreements before attempting to remove executives unilaterally. At that moment, the door to Daniel's office flew open, and Robert Harrison stood in the doorway, his face a mask of concern. What's going on? My assistant said there was an emergency involving Centaur Capital. Daniel jumped to his feet. Dad, she tricked me. Carrie manipulated me into signing something without explaining the consequences. Robert's eyes moved from his son to me, then to the document on the desk. What is this? I gestured to the speakerphone. Victor Reynolds is on the line. He can explain the situation. Victor's voice filled the room again. Robert, your son has triggered the change of control provision by removing Carrie Sullivan from her executive position without board approval. As you know, this activates our firm's rights under the investment agreement you signed 3 years ago. Robert picked up the document, his eyes scanning it quickly. When he looked up, his expression was a mixture of anger and disbelief. He stared at his son, then at the signature at the bottom of the page. For a long moment, no one spoke. Robert's jaw had gone slack, the implications of what had happened sinking in. The corporate chess match had reached checkmate, and Daniel had never even realized he was playing. The hours following Daniel's disastrous performance review were a blur of emergency meetings, frantic phone calls, and legal consultations. Robert immediately called for an emergency board meeting, which was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon. In the meantime, he summoned the company's general counsel and outside attorneys to his office. Daniel spent those hours alternating between rage and panic. I overheard him in the hallway arguing loudly with the general counsel. "There has to be a way to undo this," he shouted. "I'll just retract my signature. The document hasn't been processed by HR yet." "It doesn't work that way, Mr. Harrison," the attorney replied patiently. "Once the triggering event occurred and Centaur Capital was notified, the provision was activated. The signature itself was the legal action that counts, not any internal processing." I maintained a professional demeanor throughout the morning, continuing with my scheduled work as if it were any other day. Several colleagues stopped by my office, having heard rumors of a major development involving the investors. I politely deflected their questions, suggesting that any announcements would come through official channels. Jessica, however, knew me well enough to sense that something significant had happened. When she brought me coffee around 11, she closed the door behind her. "The executive floor is in complete chaos," she said quietly. "Robert has been on the phone non-stop. The legal team is camped out in the conference room, and Daniel looks like he's about to have a nervous breakdown. What did you do?" I gave her a small smile. "Let's just say Daniel made a decision without understanding all the implications. The details will become clear soon enough." By 1:30, the company's senior executives had assembled in the main boardroom. Marcus gave me a questioning look as I took my usual seat, clearly wondering why I was there if I had indeed been demoted, as rumors suggested. Daniel arrived last, accompanied by Robert. Both men looked grim, though Robert's expression contained a resignation that Daniel's lacked. "Before the board members join us," Robert addressed the room, "I want to clarify the situation. This morning, a change of control provision in our investment agreement with Centaur Capital was triggered. Their legal team has confirmed that the conditions were met when Daniel authorized a reassignment of carry without board approval." Murmurs spread around the table as executives exchanged glances. "What does this mean for the company?" Marcus asked, ever focused on the practical implications. Robert's expression was somber. "It means Centaur Capital now has the right to exercise warrants for additional shares at a predetermined price substantially below current market value. Once exercised, they will own approximately 40% of the company. The agreement also gives them the right to appoint 3 members to a reconstituted board of directors, and certain major business decisions will require their approval going forward." The shock in the room was palpable. Harrison Technologies had always been firmly under Robert's control, with the board largely deferring to his vision. The idea that an outside investor could suddenly have such significant influence was difficult for many to process. "How could this happen?" one executive asked, looking directly at Daniel. "Weren't these agreements reviewed before any organizational changes were made?" Daniel's face flushed, but before he could respond, Robert intervened. "The responsibility ultimately rests with me. I should have ensured that all members of the executive team were fully briefed on the terms of our investor agreements." His defense of his son even now was both admirable and frustrating, but there was no time to dwell on it as the board members began arriving, including Victor Reynolds and 2 colleagues from Centaur Capital. The board meeting itself was tense and occasionally heated. Daniel attempted to argue that he had been entrapped into signing the document, a claim that was quickly dismissed by Centaur's attorneys. "The agreement is clear, and Mr. Harrison signed with full authority," their lead counsel stated. There was no obligation for Miss Sullivan or anyone else to warn him of the consequences of his own actions as an executive officer of the company. The company's outside counsel confirmed this assessment. The change of control provision was properly documented in agreements that all executives have access to. There is no legal basis to claim entrapment in this scenario. As the discussion continued, Daniel became increasingly desperate, shifting blame to everyone but himself. Carrie deliberately set me up. She knew exactly what would happen and manipulated the situation. Abigail Winters, who had always appreciated my strategic thinking, actually smiled slightly at this outburst. So your argument is that a junior executive with less than a year at the company outsmarted a Harvard MBA who was given a VP position. That's not making the case you think it is, Daniel. The meeting continued for over 3 hours as the board discussed options and implications. Centaur Capital made it clear they intended to exercise all their rights under the agreement, though they emphasized their interest was in maximizing the company's value, not disrupting operations unnecessarily. We invested in Harrison Technologies because we believe in its potential, Victor stated. That hasn't changed, but we now need to ensure that potential isn't compromised by inexperienced leadership or impulsive decisions. By the end of the meeting, several things had been decided. Centaur would exercise their warrants immediately, resulting in their increased ownership stake. The board would be reconstituted within 30 days, with Centaur appointing 3 directors. And most significantly for me, all executive reassignments were put on hold pending a comprehensive review by the new board. As the meeting adjourned, Robert asked me to stay behind. Once everyone else had left, including a sullen Daniel, he closed the door and took a seat across from me. I owe you an apology, Carrie, he said, the weariness evident in his voice. I allowed my personal feelings as a father to cloud my judgment as a CEO. You don't need to apologize, Robert, I replied. You wanted to give your son an opportunity. That's understandable. But at what cost, he asked, gesturing to the empty boardroom. In less than a year, he's managed to cost the company $199 million in value and jeopardize the independence we've worked so hard to maintain. We sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the dramatic shift that had occurred in a single day. Did you plan this from the beginning? Robert finally asked. When you realized what Daniel was doing? I considered my answer carefully. I didn't plan for this specific outcome. But when it became clear that Daniel was determined to remove me regardless of my performance or contributions, I made sure I understood all the potential implications. The rest was his decision. Robert nodded slowly. It was brilliantly played. I'm not sure whether to be impressed or concerned that such a significant provision could be triggered so easily. Corporate governance exists for a reason, I pointed out, to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral action without proper oversight. As news of the day's events spread throughout the company, reactions were mixed. Many were concerned about what Centaur's increased influence would mean for the company's direction and culture. Others, particularly those who had suffered under Daniel's chaotic leadership, seemed cautiously optimistic about the potential for more stable management. Daniel himself was conspicuously absent the following day, and rumors circulated that he had been asked to take a leave of absence while the situation was sorted out. Robert confirmed this in a company-wide email, stating only that Daniel Harrison will be taking some time away from day-to-day operations to focus on strategic projects. By the end of the week, the company's stock price had actually increased slightly as the market digested the news of Centaur's larger stake. Their reputation as a savvy technology investor apparently outweighed concerns about the unusual circumstances. In a surprising development, I received a call from the board's lead independent director on Friday afternoon, requesting a private meeting the following Monday. The board would like to discuss the company's leadership structure moving forward, she explained. Your perspective would be valuable. As I hung up the phone, I realized that what had begun as Daniel's attempt to remove me from the company might actually result in a very different outcome than he had anticipated. The chess pieces were still moving and the game was far from over. Monday morning arrived with a sense of anticipation throughout Harrison Technologies. The weekend had given everyone time to process the dramatic events, but there was still significant uncertainty about what would happen next. The leadership vacuum created by Daniel's absence and the pending board changes left many departments unsure of how to proceed with ongoing projects. I arrived early for my meeting with the board's lead independent director, Patricia Montgomery. A former technology CEO herself, Patricia had always been fair and thoughtful in her board role. She welcomed me into the conference room where 3 other people were already seated: Victor Reynolds, from Centaur Capital, Abigail Winters, and surprisingly, Robert Harrison himself. Thank you for joining us, Carrie. Patricia began once I was seated. The events of the past week have created an unusual situation that requires thoughtful leadership decisions. Victor picked up the thread. Centaur Capital has exercised its rights under the investment agreement, and we're now the second largest shareholder in Harrison Technologies. While the board will be formally reconstituted in the coming weeks, we need to address immediate leadership concerns. I nodded, waiting for them to continue. The board has been discussing the company's needs during this transition period, Patricia explained. We believe stability and continuity are paramount, particularly for our clients and employees who may be concerned about the recent changes. Robert, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. Carrie, I want to be direct. The board is asking you to step into the role of Chief Operating Officer during this transition. You would report directly to me and have authority over day-to-day operations across all departments. The offer was unexpected. Despite my strategic maneuvering to protect my position, I hadn't anticipated being offered a promotion, especially one that would effectively give me the authority that Daniel had so desperately wanted. This would be a significant change in the leadership structure, I observed. What about Daniel's position? The four exchanged glances before Robert answered. Daniel will be stepping away from operational roles. He'll retain a board seat as a significant shareholder, but he won't have direct management responsibilities for the foreseeable future. It was a diplomatic way of saying that Daniel was being removed from any position where he could cause further damage. We've reviewed your performance and contributions over the past 5 years, Abigail added. Your strategic vision and execution have been exemplary. The recent situation demonstrated not just your understanding of corporate governance, but your ability to think several steps ahead, a quality we need right now. Victor leaned forward. From Centaur's perspective, we invested in Harrison Technologies partly because of the strong executive team. Recent events highlighted vulnerabilities in that structure, but they also showed which leaders truly understand how to protect the company's value. The implication was clear. They saw my actions not as undermining Daniel, but as protecting the company from his inexperience and poor decisions. I appreciate your confidence, I replied carefully. Before I accept, I'd like to understand the parameters of the role and what you see as the priorities during this transition. Over the next hour, we discussed the specifics of the COO position and the immediate challenges facing the company. Centaur's increased influence would bring changes, but they emphasized their interest was in growth and value creation, not micromanagement. Robert would remain CEO, though, with some additional oversight from the board. I'd also like to address the initiatives that have been sidelined over the past months, I said. Several strategic projects with significant potential were abandoned during the recent reorganization. We'd like a full assessment and recommendations, Patricia confirmed, particularly the international expansion strategy that was gaining traction before it was paused. After thorough discussion, I accepted the position with several conditions: authority to rebuild the teams that had been dismantled, resources to revive key strategic initiatives, and direct involvement in selecting the new executive team, members who would be needed to fill gaps in the structure. By the end of the day, the appointment was announced company-wide. The email sent under Robert's name, but clearly influenced by the board, emphasized continuity and strategic focus. It positioned the change as part of the company's ongoing evolution rather than a direct response to the events with Centaur Capital. The reactions throughout the company were varied but largely positive. Many of the employees who had suffered under Daniel's chaotic leadership were visibly relieved. Jessica didn't bother hiding her satisfaction. It's about time, she said when she brought me the stack of paperwork for my new role. Though I suspect there are going to be some awkward family dinners at the Harrison household for a while. She wasn't wrong. Daniel's removal from operational roles was handled with as much dignity as possible. But there was no disguising the reality: the CEO's son had been deemed unsuitable for leadership and effectively demoted to a ceremonial role. To his credit, Robert handled the situation with professionalism. In our first one-on-one meeting after my appointment, he was candid about the challenges. This isn't how I envision the company's leadership evolving, he admitted. But I'm a businessman first, and the board's decision makes sense for Harrison Technologies right now. How is Daniel taking it? I asked, genuinely concerned about the family dynamics. Robert sighed. Not well. He feels betrayed by me, by you, by the board. It will take time for him to understand that this was the consequence of his own actions, not a conspiracy against him. Over the following weeks, I set about rebuilding what Daniel had broken. The first priority was bringing back the talented team members who had been sidelined. Jackson returned to his market analysis role. Stephanie resumed leadership of international strategy, and other key personnel were restored to positions that matched their skills. I also began implementing the strategic initiatives that had been abandoned, starting with the Asia-Pacific expansion that had shown such promise before Daniel's interference. With the board's support, we restarted negotiations with key partners and began rebuilding relationships that had been damaged. The technical teams were relieved when I officially canceled Daniel's ill-conceived product overhaul and returned focus to our core strengths. Instead of a complete replacement, we developed an enhancement roadmap that would deliver meaningful improvements without the risks and contract violations of Daniel's approach. Throughout the company, the atmosphere gradually shifted from uncertainty to cautious optimism. The chaos of the past months gave way to more structured processes and clear communication about priorities and direction. Daniel himself remained a peripheral figure, occasionally appearing for board meetings but otherwise absent from day-to-day operations. According to Robert, he was exploring other opportunities, though it was unclear what those might be given the circumstances of his departure. My new role brought challenges I hadn't anticipated. Some executives who had allied themselves with Daniel were resistant to the new structure, requiring difficult conversations and, in a few cases, managed departures. Others who had been on the sidelines during the conflict now sought to align themselves with the winning side, requiring careful assessment of their true capabilities and loyalties. The relationship with Centaur Capital evolved into a productive partnership. Victor and his colleagues brought valuable perspectives from their experiences with other technology companies, while respecting the operational expertise of the existing management team. Their 3 appointees to the reconstituted board were experienced technology executives who asked thoughtful questions without micromanaging. 6 weeks into my new role, Robert invited me to dinner at a quiet restaurant away from the office. After we ordered, he sat back and regarded me thoughtfully. "You know, when I hired you 5 years ago, I saw potential, but I never imagined you'd end up saving the company from my own blind spot." "The company wasn't at risk because of your blind spot, Robert," I replied carefully. "It was at risk because leadership decisions were being made without proper understanding of their implications." He nodded slowly. "That's a diplomatic way of saying my son was in over his head and I was too proud to see it." "We all have blind spots when it comes to family," I offered. "That's why corporate governance exists, to provide checks and balances." Robert was quiet for a moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "I owe you an apology, Carrie. I should have stepped in sooner when I saw how Daniel was treating you and others. I convinced myself he just needed time to grow into the role." "You wanted to believe in your son. That's natural." "Perhaps. But as CEO, my first responsibility is to the company and everyone who depends on it." He set his glass down with finality. "I've learned an expensive but valuable lesson about the dangers of nepotism." Our conversation shifted to the future of Harrison Technologies, the strategic directions we were pursuing, and the opportunities ahead. For the first time since Daniel had arrived, I felt Robert and I were truly aligned again in our vision for the company. As we were finishing dessert, Robert surprised me with an unexpected question. "If you were in my position, what would you do about Daniel long term?" I considered the question carefully. "I think that depends on what Daniel learns from this experience. If he can recognize where he went wrong and genuinely develop the skills and judgment needed for leadership, there might be a path back eventually in a role that matches his actual capabilities, not his last name. But that transformation would need to be real, not just performative." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "That's a wise assessment, and considerably more generous than many would offer after what happened." As we left the restaurant, I realized that despite the tumultuous journey, Harrison Technologies was in a stronger position now than before the crisis. The leadership was more aligned, the strategic direction was clearer, and we had stronger governance to prevent future missteps. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air. The announcement came 3 months after my appointment as COO. Daniel Harrison was officially leaving Harrison Technologies to pursue entrepreneurial opportunities. The press release was polite and professional, wishing him success in his future endeavors. Within the company, the news was received with minimal reaction. Everyone had already adjusted to the new reality. Harrison Technologies moved forward stronger for having weathered the storm. And I found myself in a position I had never anticipated when I first joined the company as a former lawyer looking for a new challenge. The corporate chess match had yielded unexpected results for everyone involved. 6 months after the dramatic events that reshaped Harrison Technologies, I found myself in my expanded office reviewing our quarterly results. The numbers told a compelling story: revenue up 17% year-over-year, customer retention at 96%, despite the turbulence and 3 successful product launches that had been planned before Daniel's interference, but only implemented after his departure. The company had not just survived the crisis, it was thriving. The leadership team had stabilized with a mix of long-term executives who had weathered the storm and new talent we had recruited to fill specific gaps. Even the relationship with Centaur Capital had evolved into a genuine partnership, with their industry connections helping us expand into new markets faster than we could have managed alone. As I reviewed the presentation for the upcoming board meeting, I found myself reflecting on the moral complexity of how everything had unfolded. Had I deliberately set a trap for Daniel? Not exactly. I had simply understood the rules of the game better than he did, and when he made his move, I was prepared for the consequences. Was it fair? That question had lingered in my mind. Daniel had been determined to remove me regardless of my performance or contributions to the company. He had systematically undermined and isolated me, reassigned my team members, and finally attempted to humiliate me with the basement office demotion. In that context, using my knowledge of corporate governance to protect myself seemed not just fair but necessary. Still, I hadn't anticipated the full impact on the company or the Harrison family. The $199 million equity shift to Centaur Capital was substantial, and the family dynamics had been permanently altered. Robert and Daniel's relationship remained strained, though they had begun speaking again, according to occasional comments Robert made. The experience had changed my approach to leadership in subtle but important ways. I became more transparent with my team about the reasoning behind strategic decisions, ensuring they understood not just what we were doing but why. I instituted regular governance reviews to ensure all executives were familiar with key provisions in our corporate agreements. And I became more deliberate about mentoring promising employees, giving them meaningful growth opportunities without the shortcuts Daniel had expected. My relationship with Robert had evolved as well. The initial awkwardness after Daniel's departure had given way to a new dynamic of mutual respect. Robert remained CEO, but he increasingly sought my input on major decisions and publicly credited my contributions. The mentor-mentee relationship had become more balanced, a partnership of complementary strengths. Daniel himself had indeed started a venture of his own, a small consulting firm working with family-owned businesses. According to industry gossip, he positioned himself as an expert in succession planning and next-generation leadership. An ironic choice given his own experience, but perhaps evidence that he had gained some self-awareness from the process of an ordeal. In quiet moments of reflection, I sometimes wondered if there had been another path, a way to manage Daniel's integration into the company that might have yielded different results. Could more direct feedback early on have helped him course correct? Would stronger boundaries from Robert have prevented the worst excesses? Or was the combination of entitlement, inexperience, and power simply untenable from the start? These questions had no definitive answers, but they informed how I approached my own leadership challenges. When we acquired a smaller company 6 months after Daniel's departure, I was particularly attentive to the cultural integration, ensuring that talented people weren't lost in the transition and that leadership roles were assigned based on capabilities rather than pre-existing titles. The business lessons from the experience were invaluable. First, corporate governance exists for a reason. The provisions that had seemed like legal technicalities turned out to be critical protections when normal decision-making processes broke down. Second, documentation matters. My habit of maintaining detailed records of decisions and communications had provided the evidence needed when questions arose about what had actually occurred. Third, relationships throughout the organization are crucial. The alliances I had built with people at all levels had provided support during the difficult period and made the transition to new leadership much smoother. Most importantly, I had learned that earned authority is fundamentally different from granted authority. Daniel had been given his VP title and power by his father, while I had earned my position through consistent performance and results. When challenges arose, that distinction became clear to everyone in the organization. The personal cost of the corporate battle had been significant. For months, the stress and isolation had taken a toll on my well-being. Evenings and weekends had been consumed by work and strategy rather than personal pursuits. Relationships outside the company had been neglected as I focused on survival within it. Part of my healing process involved reclaiming that balance. I started leaving the office at reasonable hours, reconnected with friends I had neglected, and resumed the hiking trips that had always helped clear my mind. The company was important, but it wasn't everything. In my new leadership role, I faced different challenges than before. Strategic decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions in company value required careful consideration. Being responsible for others' livelihoods brought a weight that balanced the authority of the position. When newer employees occasionally asked about the Daniel situation, as it had become known in company lore, I was careful to focus on the governance lessons rather than personalizing the conflict. There was nothing to be gained from villainizing him further, and more value in emphasizing the structural factors that had allowed the situation to develop. The experience had reinforced my belief that in corporate environments, preparation and knowledge are often more powerful than formal authority. Understanding the rules, whether they're written in contracts embedded in culture or unspoken but universally acknowledged, provides options when direct power is limited. For those navigating similar situations, my advice would be consistent: document everything, build genuine relationships across the organization, understand the governance structures you operate within, and maintain your professionalism even when others don't. These practices won't guarantee success, but they create options when challenges arise. As I finished my review of the quarterly presentation, my phone buzzed with a message from Robert. "Got a minute to discuss the Westlake acquisition target?" it read. "Your insight on the cultural fit would be valuable." I smiled slightly at the evolution our working relationship had undergone. From the lawyer he'd hired for strategic thinking to the executive who had outmaneuvered his son to the trusted partner helping shape the company's future, it had been quite a journey. Standing to head to his office, I reflected that corporate environments, for all their complexity and occasional brutality, also reward those who understand their dynamics and act with strategic intelligence. The CEO's son had learned that lesson the hard way. I hoped others would find less expensive paths to the same wisdom. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone tried to undermine you only to have their plans backfire? What strategies did you use to protect yourself in a professional environment? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story of corporate chess and strategic thinking resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more tales from the business world. Remember, sometimes your greatest power comes not from your title, but from truly understanding the rules of the game you're playing. Thanks for watching. And until next time, stay strategic.